This is a video about lateral reading, which is a strategy that you can use when you're online and you're trying to determine whether or not the source or the website is trustworthy. So in an article in a study called Lateral Reading, Reading Less While Learning More When Evaluating Digital Information, Weinberg and McGrew talk about how they selected three groups of people: professional fact checkers, historians, and students. And they wanted to figure out how people navigate the web and how they determine whether or not a site is trustworthy. So you can read this entire quote on your own. In fact, I encourage you to read the entire article, but I want to zoom in on the definition of lateral reading because it can sound kind of complicated, but it's something that many of you might just do naturally or kind of intuitively. In contrast, this is in contrast to using some traditional methods of determining the reliability of a source, which we'll talk about later. In contrast, lateral readers paid little attention to such features, right? Slick graphics, lack of ads, academic language, a fancy logo, an about page. They ignored that, and instead, they leapt off the site after a few seconds and opened new tabs. They investigated a site by leaving it. Paradoxically, a key feature of lateral reading is not reading. So as important as deep reading is, right, really unpacking passages or unpacking a website or a text, when you are trying to determine whether or not a source is trustworthy, what these researchers found was that leaving the site is actually a really great way to learn more about the site. So lateral just means on the side. It means that you're opening up search tabs and you're also practicing click restraint. So you're not necessarily clicking the first article that pops up when you research that organization or when you add in some keywords. Instead, you're skimming through and you're looking maybe on the second page of your search results or maybe a couple of entries down. So you learn more about a website precisely by leaving it. And you can use tools like Wikipedia. I know you've all heard time and again to avoid citing Wikipedia. And while Wikipedia does have a lot of incorrect information, it also has some fantastic information that you can use when you are reading laterally, when you're opening up other search tabs and learning more about the site or the supposed news organization that you're reading. So one of the things that the researchers point to in their study, or one of the examples that they used, was a bullying article or bullying articles that were on two organizations' websites: the American Academy of Pediatrics versus the American College of Pediatrics. Now, both of these organizations have very neutral, professional, academic, medical sounding titles, right? But what the researchers found was that students believed that the American College of Pediatrics, based on looking at their website, that the American College of Pediatrics was a more trustworthy source. Historians, they were a little bit of both. Some thought the American Academy of Pediatrics, others thought the American College of Pediatrics. Fact checkers, though, realized pretty quickly that the American Academy of Pediatrics was the more reliable source, was the more politically neutral source, scientific source. So if you do this on your own, if you do this experiment on your own, if you go to both organizations' websites and you just look at the About page, the board of directors, their logo, their professional citations, the tone, the jargon, if there are spelling errors, if the website is easy to navigate, it can seem as if these two websites are equally reliable, right? I encourage you to go to both of the websites and do this. But if you open up another search tab and you Google or Bing American College of Pediatrics, very quickly you will realize that most people do not consider them nonpartisan. In fact, if you open up another tab to research more about the American College of Pediatrics, you'll find pretty quickly that organizations such as the Southern Poverty Law Center have referred to them as a hate group, and many other news sources consider them to be anti-gay. Now, of course, you can kind of go down the rabbit hole of lateral reading. Once you find a source from the Southern Poverty Law Center labeling them a hate group, you might then look up a little bit more information about the Southern Poverty Law Center to determine whether or not that's a source that you find reliable. So Unfortunately, there's no one definitive source of truth, right? There's no one fact-checking website, but you do have a lot of tools that you can use in addition to lateral reading. So one is to use these fact-checking websites like factcheck.org or Snopes or PolitiFact. But it's also important, because websites change, sometimes things change without you even realizing it, that you use your brain, that you use your critical thinking skills, and that you read laterally. You might also find that you're in an information or news bubble, right? We have social media feeds that are curated. Even Google tracks us. So you might use other search engines. I cannot verify that one of these is better than the other. I just default to Google, but a lot of people like DuckDuckGo or Bing or Wolfram Alpha when they want to get out of that news bubble. So we were talking about lateral reading and how lateral reading is a really important strategy. In fact, the researchers who wrote the article that we just referred to, they argue that lateral reading is better than these checklists or these information literacy checklists that teachers and librarians often give to students. What you see here is an infographic from the International Federation of Library Associations and Institutions. You can read that laterally if you want to and find out more about that organization. But it gives you some, I think, great techniques for how to spot fake news, right? Can think about the source, check the author, make sure it's not satire, make sure it's not a piece like The Onion, something that's satirical. Check your own biases. If you find that this article makes you extremely angry or resentful, that might be for some sort of purpose. Generally, news stories are not overly emotional. So these are some great strategies that you can use. Also, there's a test called the CRAP test, currency, relevance, authority, accuracy, and purpose. We'll talk more about this a little bit later. These are other strategies that you can use. What do you think? Do you think that lateral reading trumps these checklists and these other strategies? Or do you think you should use them in tandem? According to Weinberg and McGrew, again, the researchers who conducted this story with fact checkers, students, and historians, quote, relying on checklists could make students more vulnerable to scams, not less. Fact checkers succeeded on our tasks, not because they followed the advice we give to students. They succeeded because they didn't. So I find that kind of alarming, but really interesting. The idea is that students are taught to go through these checklists, right, to determine the legitimacy of the site by looking at the site. But what they seem to be arguing is that because sites are able to be pretty slick, or to use citations, or to come up with cool logos, sites or people who create websites are maybe one step ahead of the rest of us. It's important to actually read laterally, and these tools that we give to students traditionally to try to determine whether or not a source is reliable, those tools are a little bit behind the times. If it's true that these tools that we give students, these checklists that we give students to determine whether or not a source is reliable, if it's true that these tools work the best, then we probably would have expected the historians who have PhDs and are trained to look for primary sources, we probably would have expected them to do even better than the fact checkers. But in this experiment, and they acknowledge the limitations of their own experiment, it was the fact checkers using the strategy of lateral reading that were able to come to a determination as to whether or not the source was reliable quickly and most accurately. What do you think? In my opinion, we should use a combination of both.